That was amazing. That was a U-turn you just took. Was that yoga that you just did? Because you turned yourself into a pretzel.
Is there a place for careijuana?
Sorry, I'm giving you the munchies, aren't I, Joda?
You're feeding people a lot of hopium.
All right. Hey, welcome everybody. Welcome to Sense and Signal. I am Joda Jensen, and I am one of your hosts today. And I am joined by my co-host,
Dan Tarker, and I come from the field of education, and that's the lens I'm bringing to this conversation.
Yep. And so today we're gonna we have the opportunity and privilege of having Brad Topliff with us today. Brad Topliff is a director of innovation, and he's been around the Silicon Valley world for quite some time, and I think we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit. But today we kind of want to talk about the notions of finding meaning at your work and how empathy kind of plays a role in you discovering the value and purpose of your work environment. And also, I think we're going to probably talk about work-life balance, and I think Brad has a very specific sort of take on that and some thoughts around that. So without further ado, hey, Brad, welcome.
Thank you.
Yep. Oh, Dan,
is this where you put the audiences clapping?
Yes, yeah. They're cheering. They're not going, yeah. I mean, especially with the suit, right? Hey. I mean, I also want to hear about your fashion designer. Like, do you have like somebody you consult or?
Yes, I have a closet full of these suits. I bring them. I don't know. For today, it's just Joda knows, and probably you do too, Dan. It's dark and gray and wet and awful and windy outside. So
we're all trapped in the Pacific Northwest.
That's right. When I was, in the green room trying to decide what exactly how I would dress, and I've seen a bunch of your podcasts, and I just thought I'd go up level it into something bright and sunny, and maybe up. It helps change my mood. It helps.
We appreciate it. We appreciate it.
We like bright and sunny.
So that everybody, so I understand what we're talking about here. All three of us live in the greater Northwest area. Brad actually lives not far from me in Portland area, and Mr. Tarker lives about 2.5 hours north of us in Seattle, Washington. So yeah,
and I guess
I thought you were about to say a sea of communists.
since this is also a non-video podcast, in addition to being on YouTube, I'm wearing a suit and tie covered in pineapples.
It's beautiful.
It's awesome.
It is beautiful.
It's very vibrant blue. And
at some point, I hope you get up, stand up, walk back, do a spin, come back, so everybody can, when they on YouTube, gets that special extra.
If I was wearing pants, I would do that.
That's now you have to do it. I never wear pants when we're podcasting.
Yeah, what are you talking about? Why is that a thing? So, all right. Have we wasted your time yet, Brad?
No, audience? I'm good. My time is yours.
So, Brad, tell us about your journey. You've a very interesting job title that I find fascinating. It's about innovation and collaboration, right? A director of innovation and collaboration. What is that, and how do I get that job?
You just make up a title, just like I think you were talking to Dan last podcast about like the made up titles. No, it was made to indicate innovation as a program, as opposed to necessarily technology innovation. Innovation is one of those words that there are as many definitions for as there are people that use it, right? And so you walk in and you just don't have common language around what it means. So the idea is to develop a program around innovation to help anybody in a company, not just the technology group, to innovate better, right? People can always say, yeah, we're innovative. Look, the thing we built right over there, but you can always innovate better. There's that sort of kind of continuous improvement, but always there's an opportunity to improve. And then I think, Dan, you said it, I added collaboration to that title. recognizing that the organization had a lot of struggles, and I think a lot of organizations do, around collaboration. It also is a term with many, many meanings, and without that kind of collaborative atmosphere, that kind of culture, innovation is really, really hard.
Right.
So,
what is innovation to you? I mean, because I've struggled with this too. Like, how do you define what innovation is? Because I hear your point. People overuse the term all the time. We want to do something innovative. And I know when you're thinking, it's not necessarily innovative, doesn't have to be something that's grandiose, right?
No,
so what is...
And it also seems to, from previous conversations, is kind of has a maybe sort of a 4-letter word aspect to it right today. Like, it seems like something you're almost remiss to bring into the conversation. Right. Why is that as well?
You can't look at a job description without seeing, or a company description these days, especially in the tech world, without seeing the word innovation in it somewhere. Right. So it's not a very good search term. It becomes so horizontal to become meaningless. I mean, I'm sure I've done thousands of presentations that actually have some sort of, Webster's dictionary calls it, right? But it's new and meaningful change to make something better. That's how I think of innovation. And that can take on any number of forms. Even if the thing you're doing isn't innovative from a world perspective, if you weren't doing it before, then it's innovative to you and your team and whoever else you're working with.
So it could be very contextual too.
For sure. Yeah. If you're doing, innovation in some small corner of accounts payable is still innovation because they weren't doing something, and you said, hey, we have a problem to solve. Let's, figure out what the problem is. Let's figure out why we want to solve it, and then find the way given the tools that we have, right? The one kind of innovation I like the best is the Apollo 13 movie, right? Where the people are...
That's the second time that's come up on this podcast. Apollo 13.
Tom Hanks is in peril, and his team, including Kevin Bacon, wasn't he in there? So they're in peril. Air's going to run out, and some guy down in mission control walks into a conference room with a bunch of engineers with duller suits than this, throws a bunch of stuff on the table and says, you got to make that thing fit in that thing using only this, right? And then they go to work and figure out how to not only create the thing, right? I think it's sort of classic square peg into a round hole that has to be airtight, but they also have to develop the process through which they got it, right? They know that the value creation is to those people who want to breathe. They need to make it a process that works for those people in a no gravity situation with things that break and they're, stressed out and all of those things, right? There's all of that contextual process that they have to do to make something that works.
Yeah, under extreme conditions in that case, but not all innovation has to take place in a life or death situation, right?
It's a Tom Hanks movie, so it's one in which we can all relate.
Exactly.
Is there a natural constraints aspect to innovation? Is that sort of one of the definitions, that innovation has a canvas by which it is sort of identified as them being innovation?
I mean, like anything else, it depends, right? If you're going to talk about innovation in the world of AI and you're sort of like, in theory, it can do anything. Let's talk about anything, right? But if you're going to say, what can it do today versus what can it do in 10 years, then it's a different answer, right? You say, well, we want to improve the lives of some, business users today. You're not going to go give them an AI tool that does something. You're going to give them Google Forms or whatever the tools they have at their fingertips. They don't have to go to IT and buy that. That they're like, I think they say the best kind of creativity, because innovation is creativity, is with constraints, right? That's when that's when you can really shine. It's when it's meaningful.
That's when it's funnest for me. Those are the funnest challenges. I mean, I agree with everything you just said, but just from a personal, professional perspective. That's when I really enjoy when someone says exactly that scene from Apollo 13 says, you got to do all this with just this stuff. Go crazy. I love those challenges.
I think it's true in the arts too, right? Like if you're in a creative endeavor, like creating a play or a short story or artistic thing, you're limited by the tools that you have. And sometimes, you set up barriers for yourself. Like I'm going to write a story with that features a branch, a dog, and a mongoose, right? I gotta fit those three elements of the story, right? Or
and it's in a time period of, early 20th century Kansas, right? They're not going to have cell phones and smartphones and all the things to solve the problem. They're going to have to deal.
Yeah,
that's
so
why
you
we
set
see
up the
more
constraints.
period pieces. Yep. So that's sort of the innovation and collaboration idea of a program around that, right? Like how can we in a particular company make those things better? And sometimes it's both, sometimes it's one. It depends on, the problem at hand. So this was from the office of the COO, and I would look across the company and I could find problems to solve, especially ones around collaboration. You go, hey, this department's doing this. Did you know that products got a thing over there that you need? And no, we didn't know that. And it's not many people in larger organizations think about what's going on in other parts of the organization. They focus more on
they're all siloed.
Yep.
I'm wondering before we jump into when we're going to do a little deep dive on this stuff, but why are you where you're at? Why are you an innovation director? Why is innovation both a 4-letter word for you, but something that also that you want to rehabilitate into something meaningful? What is it? How did you get here? Why is this something that's interesting to you?
Well, it was later in my career that I realized that's what I've been doing all along. Since I started, in a lot of ways, my career started in high school. We were talking earlier, I went to high school where Wozniak and Jobs went to high school, though probably, I don't know what it was, 15 years later. And so, but Apple was growing up. It was the Silicon Valley. We had computers, and I was the production manager for our previously and also when I was there, award-winning school newspaper. So like nationally known in those circles, right? It was competitive to get in, but we had computers. So ours was the very first year that we used computers to print out in PageMaker 1 an entire page of a newspaper, where before they would strip print and glue it all down. And if you wanted to make edits, you sort of cut out little words, but we did something completely different there. And I, of course it's desktop publishing. It didn't exist at the time. And I didn't think about that. I just thought, oh yeah, we're using this thing to do the thing that we want to. It's fun, right? It was exciting.
I do want to make a note that first off, people who are probably under 30 probably don't know what PageMaker is, and people under 20 probably don't know what a newspaper is. So we're
fair.
True.
Yes, these are original Adobe products. They still exist today, right? We were using something called Illustrator 88, where today you have Adobe Illustrator. And I think that even young people today can understand that particular.
Oh, they know their Creative Suite, their Creative Cloud.
That's right. Yeah, it all still exists. It's just these were the beginnings, and really they're not that much different than they were then. Just more powerful. So that led me to I went through college using those skills, traveled around the world for 5 years using computer skills to I could always get a job somewhere using a Mac. And then at some point I would come home and I would work at Apple again. And I'd work at Apple as a temp first it was the Career Center, but then it was in something called New Media, where they were trying to figure out how these new things that were appearing would benefit Apple. And it was, you could, if I talked to somebody in IT and got hooked up to this network where there were all these words and images and chat rooms and stuff, right? And never seen such a thing. And, there weren't really any graphics, and you kind of go through and like, what is this? Genealogy was big. The IRC chat rooms, those were big. And And then as I continued that sort of path of travel, eventually I came home back to the Bay Area, and all the billboards had URLs on them, and I was like, "Hey, what happened? I thought that was my thing, right?" And the world is
so they became popular.
The internet was there, and that was that was amazing, and it opened up doors because I'd already sort of knew stuff. So
right.
Again, I would get jobs along in other media agencies, helping companies like Apple or Pioneer or these big companies, Disney. I had no idea how to use GIFs, how to use any of these things to sort of meet their goals, right? So eventually, that I was always in between art because I could call myself a graphic designer. When I was using the computer, I'd be a graphic designer, but then art students figured out how to use computers, and I knew I had to move on from that because I was not all that good an artist. I could replicate a lot of stuff, but I could also talk to the engineers. As I use those computers to also learn how to do pretty light programming. I just didn't head in that direction, but I was sort of in between departments all the time, and user experience is sort of a natural place that I landed, helping build a company from no user experience at all, where engineers just built feature lists full of stuff, to one, which is where Joda and I met, that actually valued the user, which itself, user experience itself, was a product that we had to bring to the engineers and sell them because they had their way of doing things, and everything outside of that was slowing them down. We said, it looks that way, but not really, because it will, you're going to make all these mistakes, or you're going to do these things, or you're going to, the launch dates and all that. Built a couple products in that company, which were awesome. They were for business users. But in the end, when we launched them after years of building, either the salespeople wouldn't sell them, or the marketing people wouldn't put any money to them. So we're just like, well, why did we do that for 5 years? And that's where innovation came in. Why are we making these decisions? Where do our ideas come from? How are they processed? And the answer was basically at the executive suite, right? If the CTO of the company heard of an idea he kind of liked, he'd go, "Hey, why don't you go do that?" And then, but he wasn't checking in with marketing to say, "Hey, we're going to do this. And when we're done doing it, we're going to sell it." And the things that I built while they were, and Joda did too, they were great, amazing products that are even better than ones that exist today, but they were outside of the business model of the company. And nobody at the company really understood the whole business model. We just didn't talk about it. So that's why that's the long answer to how I got involved in innovation.
Yeah, a couple of things about that. One, I'll agree. I think there's a lot of people and organizations who really don't have a full comprehension of what the overall organization does. I think that's even true in higher education. You think we all would have consensus about what we're doing, but I would say that that's true even in organizations like higher ed. But what fascinates me about what you just shared, going back to our previous episode with Dan Torres, is your positionality within that workplace environment. And it sounds like you are kind of at an intersection between engineering and marketing and art and probably this executive offices as well.
Yes.
And that positionality gives you kind of a perch where you can see a lot of different things going on and be able to make those connections that other people aren't able to make, which helps facilitate innovation.
It does. And in that organization, user experience was part of product, so therefore attached to engineering, and of course, product managing and building from idea to launch these products. You got to know the engineers, and it's an engineering-led organization. So you're either making a product or you're selling a product, and everybody else is kind of just supporting things. But I was told when I said, "Hey, why are we doing this way? We could do it better. And let's start an innovation program." They said, "Oh, well, the CEO would never allow someone to have innovation in their title because you just hire smart people and they'll innovate." And they left it at that, right? So then when the leadership of the company changed, I was able to pitch an actual program to promote process and the ideals around innovation and facilitation and workshopping, and we had a natural group of people that were good at helping that in the user experience group, because that's the people who are trained to ask questions instead of assert answers.
Interesting. And so how do you go, it sounds like you go to different parts of your company, identify problems, and then coach them on how to innovate. What does that look like? Like, how do you identify the problem? And then what things do you say to people to help stimulate that innovative process?
Well, it's a long time in the company. When you're around for a long time, I think Bill Murray said it in Groundhog Day. He's like, maybe God's just been around for so long, he knows everything, right? So after a while, all the people, you hear, and you've
heard it over and over and over again, every generation.
People trust you to talk and say, hey, yeah, this is really frustrating. They might not come to you and expect help, because in some organizations, no one expects help. They just try to get done with whatever's on their desk. And if you approach them and say, hey, I saw what you were doing, or I heard something in that meeting, can you explain what you're doing, what you're trying to do? And then you identify roadblocks, and the look on people's faces when you are actually there and trying to help them, and not sort of undermining with your own agenda just because you're trying to make the company better, then that has a roll-on effect where more people will say, hey, I have, this problem. Or it comes from an executive land where they go, hey, this is kind of a problem. Can you work on it for a while? Until either the parties involved resist so much that it's not worth continuing, or, you find a path and make it better.
Yeah, because I can imagine you going into someone and saying something like that you might initially get some resistance or some defensiveness, and you have to build some trust to be able to open that dialogue.
Yeah, for sure. And depending on which direction decisions are made, you don't always get that trust. Even executives are looking over the fence at the other person, battling for budget, battling for the attention of the executive above them, for the board, whatever it is. There's so much politics involved that people don't want to open up and ask for or accept help often. And that's a culture problem.
It's what I'm hearing too is there's this confluence, and maybe you sort of stated at the beginning, but there is, from your description, there is this confluence of innovation and dialogue, communication internally, the ability to have open conversations with people, and the right conversations at the right time. And, it's almost, as much as you are an innovation director, you're almost a dialogue director, a conduit.
It's a facilitator.
Facilitator. And there's a conflation in there, which I find interesting, because I almost, hearing you talk, the innovation isn't necessarily in what gets produced, but in how it was produced. Does that resonate with you at all?
Yes. For me, innovation is a process. And, and as people will, you often hear, you got to fail fast. That's if the process allows you to fail fast, right? It's you design that process to experiment if you can, like whatever the thing is, with those pieces that are on the table.
Interesting.
Yeah. So how does Agile fit into that, into your innovation, your innovating process?
Well, Agile changed the game a little bit from sort of the waterfall of how products went with the product manager at the top, and it made it more of I'm a product owner. I'm absorbing the things that go in. We're taking it in smaller chunks, so so people feel more comfortable adding their 2 cents into the process, rather than just having these giant monoliths that come in serial, so that no one really wants to break into the monolith. When something's too hard in an organization, people just stop doing it. They're like, something's easier over there. I don't have to beat my head against this wall. And if that black box you're talking about is so confusing, or, just inputs come in, outputs come out, and that's all I really know, because engineers controlled it. Agile sort of broke those black boxes open and said, let's break this into a bunch of manageable chunks in terms of time and effort, but also understanding. right? Someone can easily go, I don't understand that chunk.
Interesting. So Brad, when I asked you to do this conversation with us, you sort of said, "Yeah, we can talk about innovation, but there's something else I'm more interested in." And Dan and I said, "Screw that, we're going to talk about innovation." It sounds like,
which is fine. Like we can talk about innovation. I can talk about innovation.
Great thumbnail.
Yeah. But before we move on to the next episode, there was something I thought would be kind of interesting. You mentioned Kool-Aid. You drunk the Kool-Aid. What does Silicon Valley Kool-Aid taste like? And what are we talking about?
I suppose it tastes like, I heard this just the other day on a podcast. It tastes like Hopium.
Hopium. Love it.
That was a politics thing, but you give people like, oh, I do think that, technology can change things. And I do think that I can impact those technologies. And that is the hope of change and the hope of people having other people's best interests at heart. Like that's where an optimist can really trip up, because not everybody has those drives to raise everybody up. There's still all the politics, which then makes you, curl up in a ball and go home.
And like alcohol, there you can drink too much and find yourself drunk in a gutter or in a jail. Yes. You drink just enough, your friends love you, and you have a good time. Maybe even some cool things occur. You
play pool better.
After the first beer, I'm way better. So is Hopium similar? I mean, does Hopium? Is there a good and the bad side to Hopium?
Yeah, I mean, I've stayed with startups way longer than I should have, because they're always just looked like one more. If we only just got that funding, or that person's going to buy this thing, or whatever the thing is, there's always one more thing that feels like I'm going to participate in something big. And then when it finally falls apart and, in a way that isn't fun for anybody, then that's where you got addicted to the maybe part and didn't really think about it's okay to leave things behind when they're not working for you, as opposed to just working.
This segment of the Sense and Signal podcast is brought to you by Awkward Pauses. Awkward Pauses, terrorizing podcasters since 2004. Order yours today and get 3 terrible cringe moments for free. Taxes not included. So, Hopium, it's an interesting concept, right? So...
We will edit that to a shorter
pause. Yeah, I think we're in election season, and I think that's the, it's certainly around polling was where that came up, because people read the polls in the way that they want to read them because they want their team to win.
Yeah, and you've invested so much time and effort and your hope into an organization, whether it's a startup or any type of career that you might be in, and you might be reticent to walk away because you're giving up a lot of emotion and time and energy and intellect that you've invested into this thing. And
especially early stage stuff, especially when it feels like, any number of things that I was involved in startups, all of the, startups that didn't get anywhere were cutting edge technology that 10 years later, is identity management owned by the people, more of a democratization of identity. We had this great namespace and all of this stuff, but ultimately people didn't care, and now they do. So now people want to own their identities. And we said, like we told you, but now it's too late.
Right. Yeah, because you can't. I mean, you never know how the market's going to react to the product that you're developing. But I think in the long haul, though, if you think about innovation, technology, and innovation, right, and let's take a step up, right, more of a helicopter view of it rather than inside the organization as an employee. But if you look up at the changes in technology since the 1990s, with the rise of the internet and Apple and Microsoft and so forth, it has fueled innovation. We can't really deny that. Like on a societal level, I mean, it's been dramatically transformative in negative ways, in terms of we no longer have our own identities. We're all data mines for companies. That's a negative aspect. But we also are on the verge of having self-driving cars. We're coding the human genome. We're making some real advances as well.
Sure, of course, but I mean, there's innovation for just innovation's sake, right? There's all of the things that have sort of fallen by the wayside to get there, and then there's sort of the ethics around when you're making something new, like Facebook, and all the people that go, "No, that's going to be terrible, terrible for the world." You're like, "No, it's fun. I get to, connect with all my friends." And then, fast forward a couple of years, and you're like, "Wow, we really could have used some policies or something at the beginning of that, to keep it from turning into a complete monstrosity." And you can't know, but there's no, I mean, I don't think there's a time when you can say there wasn't technology and innovation that didn't make something better, but it also comes in, the waves, right? Like, look at the new VR headset, like nobody cares. Or AI's been around since there were computers, really, like it gained in popularity and then, sort of fell off.
That's interesting, right? Because you think it's going to be a breakthrough thing and it doesn't happen.
But it will eventually be that breakthrough thing. And when you look back far enough, you're like, oh my God, look at that. All those people who said this was going to break through thing, in 1968 were right.
Right.
Sometimes,
You're just 30 years off.
Living in Silicon Valley is almost like living in a casino. You're at, in the sense that you're all at a table and you hear everybody winning next to you. You hear someone screaming over there and someone, I won. And Silicon Valley's full of, the startup down the street got $37 million of funding. And it really is, when I think about it, has that sensation, and it belies the truth on some level. Right. And it can kind of lend to abuses to some degree of people's time and energy, their spirits. I think that like a casino, one can go in and win that first time maybe, and now they continue to go back to find that high again. And I think Silicon Valley is kind of like that. You get so close, or people who are there, or literally down the street, one of the companies becomes a unicorn, and it's so tantalizing. And leaders in these companies can kind of take advantage of that and make people work to degrees that probably might, again, be unethical, right? And I know this is kind of something that you've been thinking about around, like what makes people.
Brilliant segue. That was amazing.
What do they want?
That was awesome
segue.
That was a U-turn you just took.
I know.
And I think that what you're talking about.
There's an audience here.
Is like, was that yoga that you just did? Because you turned yourself into a pretzel to get around to.
I was not listening to a damn thing you guys were saying for about 2 minutes and kind of composing that. So
how can we do this? So what you're describing
that's how we podcast.
That's how we podcast.
That segue is that a company. So for me, from the perspective I have, everything's a product. Everything, right? Like, I can't look at something and not think of it as a product. Everything has value to somebody, whatever you're creating, right? It's a policy, it's a product, a process, and people, right? A person is a product to a company, and a company is a product and a team to that person. So it offers them a value that they want to receive, and whether they stay with that company or not, or jump to the next one, then, or, if they have that opportunity, or just stick around, being sad and miserable until the whole thing falls apart, that affects their efficiency. I don't even want to say efficiency, just happiness. And then, which then affects the culture, right? Like the culture of an Uber versus, something that maybe almost anything was less toxic, male, whatever, which they believed would be their savior, right? And they made a lot of money being that, but there's a lot of people that suffered for it.
Yeah.
And so what do these leaders in these organizations look like that create this culture that you're talking about? I mean, this culture, because I've seen this toxic culture, Silicon Valley toxic culture, right? Where you're feeding off of you're feeding people a lot of hopium so that they'll stick with your company and make personal sacrifices on a venture that is probably doomed to fail, but they'll still keep investing their time and energy into it and their hopes and dreams.
And don't forget the snacks. They feed you a lot of snacks and free.
Feeding you a lot of snacks, so you stay there till 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, and are back in the office at 4 a.m. in the morning.
Well, I think that answer has changed over the last couple of years since the pandemic, and people have a little bit more opportunity to sort of move around and they ask questions. I mean, to answer your question briefly, I mean, a lot of those kind of leaders just don't care. Right? They can say they care, they can say they love their people, but it's in the actions of how they compensate them, how they're, whether they're going to, like layoffs happen, that has to happen, but it can be done in a nice way so that you don't feel like you're on the chopping block next and you're just another interchangeable cog in the giant wheel, right?
So don't do it like Elon Musk, right?
Well, they saw that coming, right? No one can deny that the Twitter people didn't see that coming, but they also wanted to get whatever severance package was due them, and so they can live in misery for a little while, right? People, like, what people talk about today is, what do people want out of work? They want a hybrid. They, like, we should send them back to the office. They want remote. There's so many different things that they want that you can have, again, a million different conversations about. They want impact in their work. They want meaning. They want compensation. They want work-life balance. They want any individual is going to have any number of things that are important to them and change over time. And I call that, workquilibrium. What people like equilibrium, but with work, it's easy to understand when you think about an individual person. You guys have had jobs, like anybody in a company, from an executive down to the people on the front line, or facilities people, or in accounts payable, or I'm picking on accounts payable for some reason today.
They deserve it. They're always late.
At the base, what people want out of work, the very base minimum viable product of the job is for things to be okay, right? Like, I want to go into work every day and not be stressed out that I'm about to lose my job, that my boss is a jerk, that the project is failing, that I don't get paid enough. I don't want to go in there and think about that. So I find this sort of equilibrium state. Everybody wants to love their job, but at a minimum, they don't want to go every day going, I'm going to go find something else. At that point, they're falling beneath this neutral buoyancy of workquilibrium, and companies, teams, wherever, people every day, they can either add weight to those employees, meaning they're dragging them down below the line, or they're floating them in very small ways. So, like work-life balance, for example, is a really big thing, and you can have lots of policies and programs in place, but people still burn out. It's all an individual thing. You can't make everybody happy, but you can care that they are or aren't, and you can train managers to care, right? Without that piece, everyone's just kind of like, oh, I better go, I better be hitting LinkedIn and finding something new because this thing drives me crazy on a daily basis. Everyone's going to hate their job or dislike their job from one, on a day or a week or whatever. But hopefully they go, oh my God, I forgot how much I love my team. I forgot how much, we finally launched something, we've impact, we're doing something. So they rise back up and go like, my job's actually pretty good.
Yeah. I'm wondering, so to mix metaphors. So the owner or the managers, the leaders of these companies, they dole out all these 6-packs of workquilibrium, and that can definitely throw you off Hopium. No, is it Hope?
Yeah, that's right.
Hopium, and then that can throw off your workquilibrium, and or at least obfuscate the fact that you're probably working in ways that are not conducive to long-term good health, whether it's physical or mental.
Right. You mean giving the promise, that unicorn promise where they go, we have a startup and we're going to change the world and all y'all are going to be billionaires, right? And people go like, ooh, I really like that. I'm way up here, right? You could make me work 90-hour weeks.
That's right.
Yeah.
You can do all sorts of things. My boss could be a jerk, but I'm like, wow, look at that. I can see. Well, I can't quite see it, but that guy just described a golden ring that I can almost see as a possibility. Right. And they go, great. but man, you're going to crash hard when, they have a layoff and you're like, oh, not everybody gets that gold ring.
And
oh.
Most will crash, right? I mean, most find the crash. And it's funny when you say, like, my boss is a jerk, all you got to do is point to Steve Jobs and go, well, Steve Jobs was a jerk and all those people, that was a great company. I guess it's okay to have a jerk boss, right? You can start to apologize. And I'm wondering, instead of maybe just don't, and I think there's a value in Hopium, right? I think we discussed this. There's a dark side and a light side to Hopium, and Hopium is what is that balance, right? And I throw that question out there, and then I also throw the question: is there a place for careijuana as opposed to hope? I mean,
careijuana. I like that.
Is there?
I like that.
Oh, wow. Okay. Is that a mixed metaphor, or is that just a gateway drug to Hopium?
But is that a currency? I feel like millennials might be expecting that currency actually more and more. I feel when I work with millennials and Z that careijuana is something that you don't care about me, then I'm not going to care about this project anymore. Then
right. I'm gonna, you're not going to pay me as much as I think other people are getting around me. Then you're going to pay me at 80%. You're going to get probably 70% out of me because it's hard.
You're going to look at me funny because I like to take 2 weeks off 4 times a year. I'm out. I have a strong sense of workquilibrium. I think that, and I think that does lean more towards younger and younger people, which I root for personally.
So I remember, I can remember someone talking to me about getting a job at, I think it was probably Palm back in the, PDA days. And, this was somebody it's a sister of somebody I went to high school with, and she's asking me questions. And I said, yeah, I think that stock options are fine, but don't let them talk you out of livable salary because of these stock options, because those can disappear just as easily as anything else. Like, stock options used to be the hopium for the Silicon Valley masses, right? They were like, oh, they gave me 25,000 somethings, right? And I've had people in a startup that were like, hey, what are you doing? We're working on this project. And this is one of the leaders, and he goes, he's just sitting there with a spreadsheet calculating that if the company sold for so much, how much he would have at the end. And I was like, dude, you're going to drive yourself nuts doing that. Like, that's gravy. Right now, do the job. And because if everybody's just focused on that thing, then you're not going to succeed at all. Right. So then that part becomes something you want to have for sure, right? The Amazon people, the Google people, they're talking about RSUs all the time and total compensation, and it just keeps like ratcheting up. And you see these, they're making lots of money, and they're like, I'm getting burned out, but damn, I'm making $700,000 a year. And everybody else, those are often engineers, right? And everybody else is just like, I just want to live, man. I want to see my kid.
Especially if you live in Silicon Valley, right, where it's uber expensive.
Washington, Seattle's the same, right?
For sure.
I want everything to be cool. I would like to get compensated, one, fairly for the work I'm actually putting in, and I would like to have a piece of the success of the whole company so that I have something to believe in, right?
So I'm going to throw in this whole hopium careijuana conversation, since we're all getting high on this, a different aspect to it. And because I come from higher ed and nonprofit sector, and those things, interestingly, I think exist there too, but in a different way, right? Because I think when you're attracted to Silicon Valley, there's a monetary reward you're looking for, as well as a prestige and changing the world through technology. And I think in education and a nonprofit, it attracts a different type of person, potentially. One that maybe is more focused on caring, getting to that careijuana, and how that could be a manipulative drug too, right? And like, we'll often hear like from leaders, like, well, you're here for the students. And the response from faculty or staff and stuff like that is like, well, I can't pay my rent. I'm living in my car. I have to go to the food bank to eat. But the response from some people in leadership, I think people who are wise don't do this, is like, well, but we need to put the students first. And it's like, no, we have to put people being able to live first. Because if you don't take care of yourself, getting back to care, if you don't take care of yourself first, you're not going to have anything give to anybody else as far as energy or thought or work effort or anything.
Right. And people are starting to, they're starting to realize, or at least they were, because now the economy's shifted and it, like the balance of power shifts, that it used to be work at the center. And then you sort of go out in these rings and you're out there somewhere, your life. But now people started to think about, wait, no, I'm at the center and my job is supposed to surround me, not I'm just going to work to work really hard just to have a life. I want my life became integrated. They used to, I never liked work-life balance because you're trying to measure two things that are not the same. So how many work units versus how many life units, where is the balance? It doesn't make any sense. And then people started talking about how it's integrated. It's more like a yin and yang because work and life are kind of integrated, but still the yin and yang have lines on them, right? In the pandemic, everything got all shaken up into
very blurry,
a work-life smoothie. And no one figured out where one starts and the other begins. And then you're like, oh, well, there's parts of that were really good. Sorry, I'm giving you the munchies, aren't I, Joda?
Yeah, you spoke too much of that careijuana.
So much careijuana that they recognize that what they that they like the part where their kid comes running through after school, even though, hey, I got to do a Zoom meeting, and that people didn't care that much. They're like,
the dogs were running around. People brought the dogs.
Your dog's going crazy for the mailman. Yeah. It's fine. Your boss isn't going to go, that was very unprofessional of you. Joda, we need to have a talk. Obviously, if you have something really important to do, but everybody from clients down got off their pedestal in the pandemic and went, I want to have that balance too. Like, I don't want to yell at people. It doesn't feel good to a jerk necessarily to yell at people. It's just a different part of his brain he's feeding.
With that said, I have been asked to wear shirts more often to meetings, and so I think there is a boundary there somewhere.
Right.
Yes. I had to ask him to wear a shirt on this podcast.
I really don't want to wear shirts at all, and that's whatever.
You have a tuxedo shirt. Make everything formal.
When I first joined, when I first got into moved to San Francisco and got my first job in the tech world, I loved the integration of my life with the tech world. All my friends came from the tech world, and I loved being with them. I loved going to bed and thinking about technology. I loved waking up and thinking about technology. I didn't want a separation of that, And then as I got older, that changed, right? And it partially due to the fact maybe I never joined one of those companies that became a unicorn and became a multimillionaire. I don't know. But at some point in time, I was like, okay, all this grind, all this thinking, which is awesome, isn't necessarily fulfilling another part of my life that's starting to feel more important to me. And so I think there's an age quotient that's part of this conversation, right?
Well, I think you recognize your values change, and the importance of the work that you're doing changes, and your assessment of your importance to that workspace also changes. I was in a meeting today where someone was referring to somebody else in a different organization, or like, who had just retired about a year ago, and they're like, whenever I had a problem, I'd contact Barbara. What was her last name again? Right? And like a year ago, she probably knew that person's last name off the tip of her tongue, and would email her and ask her these questions. And now a year later, she's gone. Barbara's like half a name now. And like how much we wrap our identities up with our jobs is kind of a manipulation too, because once we're gone, somebody's going to come in and replace us. If the organization still exists, right? Someone will come in and replace us, and a couple years from now, most people at the organization won't remember who you were or what you did.
That's definitely a function of age.
Yeah, you get wiser about that.
Part, and the other part is introspection, right? Some people are good at that, right? So that's where. People I've been at jobs for a long time. People got laid off, people quit, people got fired suddenly. And, and they would come and go like, it's an emotional moment for sure. but it's also one you're going to miss working with that person. It was nice having them around. But like people come and go. It's work. It is not like life when like somebody died or moved away, or broke up with you or whatever the thing is. And we conflate the work and life because there's certainly similarities, but your team isn't your family. They can act like your family and you can become very good friends with your smaller team, but your company, it depends on whether they care about everybody, but can they care just for an individual? That's really harder. So, which is where culture and values come into play, because you set those in a way, and if you live by them, then people feel there's sort of rules to live by, right? There's like this careijuana, I suppose, can be your value, and you're like, just there's some companies that I want to work for. Lead with the values that care for human beings, and not just let's change the world and try to sell a widget to a million people that they're not going to care about.
Yeah, and that was one of the things you wanted to talk about, and maybe we've already talked about it, but maybe we can bring it up to sort of put a finer point on it. You make a statement that empathy is the secret sauce, and when you say that, are you talking? What do you mean by that? When you say, are you referring to the organizations? Are you referring to the world, myself? What are you talking about?
Yes, I've done enough therapy to recognize that empathy is probably the secret sauce in everything, whether, but it changes in its own definition. The more I learn about how you define empathy. Brene Brown really picked up the empathy gauntlet. Pick up a gauntlet. Anyway, she picked it up and describing what empathy is versus sympathy.
And I remember saying
that's great. But years ago, in 94, Goldman had his emotional, like his EQ, your EQ instead of your IQ, right? Nobody talks about that very much anymore, but it's no less important to recognize that whether you're talking about innovation, this is where I draw it all together, innovation, product management, right? The user experience people have to have empathy with the user, be able to put yourself, empathy is putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. It fits in almost every part of a company. HR needs to have empathy for people in order to treat them nicely when they are forced to reduce, have a reduction in force. The thing with empathy, though, is that, and Dan, you were sort of talking about this with the culture and the leaders, not everybody has the same level of EQ and empathy. And there are different types. I think they say 3 or 4 different types of empathy.
And there's also dark empathy, right?
Ooh, maybe.
Is that Schadenfreude?
I think dark empathy is like where the leader is able to put themselves into your shoes, but they don't have the sympathy component of it. They don't really connect with how you're feeling. But since they know where you're at, they can use that in a very manipulative way because they are disconnected from how you're actually feeling about it.
They know how you're feeling, but they don't care.
And that is, I think we didn't talk about it in this, but studies show that something like 16% of CEOs fall on the spectrum of psychopathy. However you're going to pronounce that. And that, and they mask it with charisma and charm, but they're ambitious. The people, especially if you're a highly paid one, like you can be the CEO of something tiny, startups might be a bit different, but when you've gotten to where you are, you did that through not necessarily backstabbing. And it doesn't mean that all CEOs are like that, but there's a certain, let's make decisions and let's move fast, despite the people. They might, they know right from wrong, but they, some of them, not all 16% either, but they don't care, right? They're just like, ultimately it doesn't matter. I'm here for my success. Maybe I'm here for the success of my immediate team, and everybody else, great, if you get there or not, right? And some are going to be really good at it. And, there's cognitive empathy. I think that's part of what you were talking about.
Yeah.
And then there's emotional empathy where people can, they really tie into the emotions of others. That's, that's when you're crying when a soldier, comes home and they have video and he sees his kid for the first time. You're like, right? That's emotional empathy. And
Right.
one of them probably leads, obviously cognitive is going to lead with thought and emotion with heart, but there's got to be a mix of those things,
Right.
or you have, the spectrum of psychopaths, or you're just
Dark empathy.
totally emotional.
Yeah, because I think the dark empathy is just the
problem.
cognitive part. They got the cognitive part without the feeling part. Yeah.
I've never heard of it. That's interesting. So let's assume empathy is the lingua franca. Let's say it's the lingua franca of organizations. Let's assume that's what the lingua. It should be the lingua franca of organizations. The starting place, meaning that everything arises out of that. How I treat you, how I think about the product starts with empathy. How I think about my coworkers starts with empathy. How I think about my reports starts with empathy, which means it frames my conversation with you from the get-go. Are there structural things you think organizations can do to capture this sort of lingua franca?
Well, when you say lingua franca, I think you're talking about literally language, which is
the language of empathy. I'm being metaphorical here. The language of empathy.
Right, but there's a difference between the language and the action, right? So people put as their core values of their company empathy. That can be up there, but what did that mean? It became the new innovation.
Right.
Empathy, like you can say empathy is important, but you don't necessarily absorb the idea that it's not like IQ where it's inherent to you in theory, right? It doesn't change, but you can grow into it if you care about you and people around you. So putting that into action that's the hard part. But admitting and understanding that just saying the word is not doing it, right? It's like saying something's going to be really hard, and then when it's really hard, you're like complaining. You're like, well, you said it was like, just saying it's hard doesn't mean that it's no less hard. You have to go through the hard part. And empathy can be really hard for some people. Not all managers are going to be good at it. And if you're not going to go to someone and say, no one thinks they're not good at empathy necessarily. I don't know what goes on in other people's heads, but like everybody thinks they're good at it. So you can sort of rise people up and have them helping each other. You can model empathy pretty well, right? Like people who are good at it are probably more likely to recognize that not everybody's good at it. And they're not just going to yell at someone across the room and say, hey, you should just be more empathetic. Everybody
aren't you more empathetic? Damn you!
It gets into the difference in thinking for so many people on the autism spectrum, for example, or at least famously not particularly on the empathetic realm, but that doesn't make them bad people. It just means you don't depend on them for a hug in all cases. I'm not saying autistic people don't hug people, but it
comes down to self-awareness too, and awareness of the people around you in the organization, and treating them as individuals and understanding their limitations and your own. I did interview once a president of a college who was definitely self-aware of his own limitations around empathy. And he had to manage several crises over his career. And he went to his PIO, his public information officer, whenever he started a new job, and was like, listen, if something happens like this, I'm not going to remember to go talk to people about it. Right. So you need to help me and remind me that I need to do that work.
Yep. Yeah. You can be introspective and not be particularly good at empathy. And I think that I suppose we outsource, at least in larger companies, outsource all empathy to HR and go like, well, that sounds like HR's job to sort of figure that out, right? But fine, learning and development.
I don't find HR very sympathetic or empathetic.
No. Again, Dan, you and I have talked. I think HR is significantly different in the software world than it is in the education. I think it's different.
I listened to read a lot about HR, when it used to be called personnel department, right? And then it became human resources, which sometimes that means humans as resources. Sometimes it means resources for humans. And it depends on the person you're talking to, which one. There's the tactical, I need to get you your health benefits, as resources for humans. You need to make sure that they have the human things they need to do their job. And then there's more learning and development and efficiencies that you try to put people in, and those are a different look at the same thing. But it's not. But empathy should be everywhere, right? It's not like the COO's department should go, hey, HR, can you go figure out our culture for us? Like, no, everyone's in the culture. How? But they'll do it.
They will.
And they'll write 5 words. Sometimes they rhyme. Sometimes they spell your name of your company. And that's terrible.
They'll have to take some courses too, for sure. Okay, so I'm going to put on my Chris Matthews hat. I don't think you answered my question, Brad. So are there any structural things that need to happen? That are there structural things in organizations that you think that could be put into place, HR or not? Or is there something, how do we get to empathy? How do we get more empathetic in a world?
I think that it starts like many things with communication and an understanding that when you say empathy or when you say innovation or you say whatever, that you're defining what you mean by that at the time. But having it known that empathy is different for different people, talking like if learning and development is just going to have a bunch of webinars about, I don't even remember what webinars they put on, but if you don't want to be talking about your feelings constantly at work, but you can certainly put structural resources in place where people are like, oh, work is such a strange place because you spend so much time with those people that there's no better place to reach humans and give them information than on your Slack channel, right? So we had one that was social pets, right? And you could see so that's sort of structurally you're setting up spaces where people can go, oh, that's so cute. Or we had social yelling, right? There were social channels within that, right? And you can have the same thing with resources. You don't want to get crazy with the differences in people's neuro makeup at work, because that's a really sensitive topic. But, it is thoughts, feelings, and emotions are all different, right? And it's okay to have that sort of, whether it's going to be hey, we're all going to talk about thoughts, feelings, and emotions to try to understand what empathy means as a presentation to the company, bring in an outside speaker. Those are things that learning and development can do, but they're so soft that they often don't. Right. And they make it interesting and make it part of the common language. You don't want everybody just walking around saying empathy all the time. You want to go, but you can, without saying the word, you can give people recognition for recognizing people, right? You can go, because that's part of empathy is, people want recognition. And I see that person is, struggling, and I'm going to go talk to them about something, right? But there has to be a lot of learning for managers. It needs to be part of manager training to think about that, right? So if you talk about, there's ADHD in my family. If you recognize that someone was struggling with something and it looked like they might, that could be part of their lives, you wouldn't go, hey, do you have ADHD? Or, I've seen things where you support different groups, but some of those groups don't necessarily want to be out, that person doesn't like to speak up in meetings. Joda doesn't like to speak up in meetings. Hey, Joda, why don't you talk? Joda's going like, I wasn't speaking up because I don't want to, and now I'm on the spot, and you've made things worse, right? So you almost could look at it as sensitivity training, but it's not sensitive training that something bad happened. It's just making things better.
Right.
Interesting.
Well, that was a fascinating discussion, Brad.
It was. And I'd like to say, so Dan and I are trying to come up with this like final takeaways, like wrap it up. And I'm going to lean on you. What's our wrap up today?
Me? Yes. Or Dan?
You, Brad. The other
No,
Dan.
it's you. I don't want to be called on. That wasn't very empathetic of you.
We didn't. That's fair. What is the wrap up? I mean, ultimately, you said empathy is a secret sauce, right? And you can't just say that and walk away. So it fit the topics of innovation and product management. When you were talking to Dan Torres last time, he was talking about empathy. You have to think about your customers. So it's easy to bring in. So I think that empathy is important to building your products. It's important to building your people. It's important to your organization, and people should hopefully want to learn more about it and think about where they can improve. I think if you look at books on emotional intelligence, for example, they're like 10 ways to increase your emotional intelligence through practice. Like, be open about what you're thinking. Transparency helps in empathy. Like, there's, those lists of things, but you have to make
being vulnerable
first. Being vulnerable. That's something that that executives should do with each other, but probably don't do with each other very often, especially with an established company where there were founders that set this culture before. Good, bad, and when it's bad, nobody wants to go, let's do work therapy to understand why we're all, jerks to each other in Uber, right? And you're like, that takes a lot of introspection and sort of facilitation to get to that place and go, hey, you know what? These silos exist because of the fear culture that the original founder, who's been gone for 10 years, set up, where he just would fire people that made him mad, right? So people don't speak up, and they close in. So all of those things connect back to empathy. So if you had a takeaway for something, it's that it's really important to all aspects. It doesn't just belong in HR, and you can get better at it, but not everyone is going to be wired to be Brene Brown.
So try to be like Brene Brown. All right. I got it.
Right.
So,
right. Yeah. And if you want to do that, learn to apologize. Learn that apologies are okay. Even in business, you don't have to give away the argument to say, you know what? I spoke over you and I'm sorry. You don't have to, you have good points and I apologize.
Cool. See, Jody, you can apologize for interrupting me.
I'm never going to apologize to you, Dan. It's never going to happen.
This is a toxic work environment.
All HR.
We need an HR department, all right.
Well, Brad, thank you so much, man.
Yeah, thanks, Brad.
Pleasure.
This was amazing.
This was a lot of fun. It's nice to be on as a participant, not just a listener.
I appreciate it.
Well, we'll definitely have you back.
If you want to come back.
Thanks, guys.
Just wear another flamboyant suit.
I can come back. I can come back 30 times then, I think.
Yes. That'll be the thing. We'll say our next episode, what suit will Brad be wearing next time?
Brad wear?
Yeah. So, well, hey, thanks again. And for those who are listening, I think we gave up on you clicking likes or subscriptions, but I haven't. Try to click a like, a subscribe. Do all that
That's
stuff.
Right. Show some empathy.
Show some empathy
and click like.
Show some empathy
Joda
for
needs
us.
it. Makes him feel good. He needs the dopamine hit of a like.
It does.
It does. It helps out. Dan needs it more than I do, but it does. Yes, absolutely.
And now for some careijuana.
I've given up. I'm cynical. I have no hope. I have no hopium. Stop taking that shit.